Securities and financial planning offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor. Member FINRA SIPC. The opinions voiced in this show are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, and financial advisor or tax advisor prior to investing.
Welcome to Planning for Win Financial Guidance in Life. I'm Kevin Pinkley. Thank you for joining us today. Today we'll be discussing managing stress. And we have Mike Erickson in the studio with us today. Thank you for joining us, Mike.
Thank you for having me.
Mike, if people wanted to know a little bit more about your practice and how they could get in touch with you, how might they do that?
Well, the best way is to go to my website, ericksoncounseling.com.
Mm-hmm.
I also have a Facebook page, ericksoncounseling.com, I believe. It'll come through the website or just go directly on Facebook. I list my email address and my cell phone, so I'm not shy about answering questions over the phone and talking to people, seeing what I can do to help some folks.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. So can you tell us a little bit about your practice, what areas you cover in helping people, and maybe what type of clients you see?
Sure, I'd love to. I've been a licensed professional counselor for about 19 years. I've been in the helping profession for over 25 years. And I like to think that this field kind of found me. Early on when I was in college, I thought about all sorts of different opportunities. I used to work with kids a lot, YMCA and different nonprofit organizations. And as time went on, I just like being out in the field and working with people and keeping things exciting. And so when I moved to Texas about 20 years ago from Minnesota and just wanted to see something new. There was nothing really, a job waiting for me. So, and I found the most exciting place to work, and that was the Neuropsychiatric Center in the Texas Medical Center. It was a psychiatric emergency room where I dealt with just critical cases, severely mentally ill individuals, and in all crisis cases working with psychiatrists. We got people stabilized on medication, hospitalized if necessary. And through that, I made some connections with law enforcement. I rode with the Houston Police Department for 8 years. They had a pilot program that they really needed to be successful because of some situations they found themselves in. And so I rode literally with a police officer for 8 years every day.
Wow.
And we responded to 911 calls. And it was quite possibly the most exciting job I've ever had. I saw some really interesting things. But over the course of that, I just wanted to change. And so a series of progressions, found myself wanting to get some office space and use my license to help people in an office setting. So for the last 4 years, I've had a private practice where I just see people in office. Now, I've done that for about 18 years as a side project where I saw clients. But about 4 years ago, I became incorporated, and it became my full-time job.
Great. Well, a lot of history there and a lot of experience, and I'm sure riding around with those law enforcement people, obviously you're there for a reason, but it helps everyone, I'm sure.
It was as much for law enforcement as it was for the individuals we dealt with, the families, the individuals in crisis, those battling mental illness. It was a very interesting project, and I loved my time with the Houston Police Department. We had some really interesting situations, but I find that there was a level of stress and anxiety and pressure, depression, everything that was kind of incorporated at every call. So I found myself dealing with a lot of crisis de-escalation, stress management, both in myself and in those around me. I think the officers really appreciated me being there because it took some of the pressure off of them to deal with some really difficult situations. And in doing so, I really became cognizant of the importance of self-care, dealing with these high critical cases. I found that, ironically, in myself, I didn't stress under pressure, but it was after the crisis had been resolved. That's when I found myself just feeling that kind of lull after the adrenaline rush.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. So a lot of times when people hear the topic stress or managing stress, sometimes we think that it's the moment only. that it's only I'm dealing with stress right now, and I don't have to deal with it afterwards.
Right.
So I think a lot of the people out in the public, including myself sometimes in the past, that we can't be having stress if whatever was giving us stress has already passed, if that makes sense. So it can have lingering consequences. Is that accurate? Or?
I think so. We can all identify triggers in our life that create stress. I could list a number of things. I think in life, stress is a constant. It just varies in degrees. And what's very important, I found, is self-care, preparing yourself, taking care of yourself, eating right, getting enough sleep, exercising. Those are the big three. That every time someone comes into my office, I do an assessment and I see where they, what works for them, what they've been trying, what they've been dealing with, and try to find their baseline, and then go from there.
Well, it sounds like what you're saying is they got to take care of themselves first while they're dealing with this, because
Certainly.
then it could spill out and affect other people. It's kind of like, when we get on an airline and they give us the little spill
Yep.
of here's your oxygen mask. And, the first time you hear that, and especially if you're traveling with children, you're like, well, that's kind of an odd concept. Why wouldn't I put it on them first? And then you realize, well, if I can't take care of myself, I'm not going to be able to take care of anybody else. And I think that relates to our family, our friends, and our people we work with, that we need to take care of ourselves.
And I do use that analogy quite often.
Okay.
That folks need to take care of themselves. And if they're not managing their own stress, it's hard to be a good mom, good dad, good business partner, good colleague. It all flows over.
Well, I wanted to go back. You mentioned taking care of yourself and the physical aspect and the eating right. I mean, can you go into a little more detail of what you see people are doing that isn't working, and then how you're suggesting for them to make a
Sure.
change? And it sounds like it's just an all-encompassing process, and it's not one issue. It's the mind and the body work together, and we need to
the
address.
mind-body connection.
Yeah.
It's very important. I hear that's very in vogue, the mind-body connection, wellness. And I think oftentimes people forget to take care of themselves. They let their sleeping habits get out of whack, or their eating. They don't eat whole foods. They end up eating stuff out of a box. And there's a place for fast food. Don't get me wrong, I do enjoy fast food, but as a whole, that doesn't prepare your body to manage stress when it does peak, and it does come and go. Stress is always in fluctuation, so it's important to place yourself in the most optimal situation so your brain is ready to process the chemicals as they fluctuate, and it's best to be proactive. In preparing for this conversation, I did a not so random poll, and some of them were my clients, embarrassingly, and I would ask them just nonchalantly, how are you handling your stress? And the most common response was, oh, I just ignore it. And I kind of cringe when I hear that, because stress, when it's ignored, it doesn't give you an opportunity to be proactive, and it can escalate before you know it. People are under a lot of anxiety, blood pressure elevates, stomach, gastrointestinal problems can result from stress, days off from work. It can affect a person's performance, marital status. It's very hard on families when we're under a lot of stress.
So what I'm hearing is maybe people are saying, hey, I'm tough,
Yeah.
and I can cover it up or
Yep.
not worry about it, and then maybe, are we saying it creates other issues, correct?
Yeah, it's very pervasive. It can flow into all areas and can hit us before we even know it. And then we have our doctors telling us our blood pressure is getting high, or our loved ones are telling us that we're a little more irritable than we were in the past. Things like that. Those are the indicators that stress is a problem.
So as a suggestion, should we take time out during the day to address this? Or, what's a suggestion of?
Well, it can be dramatic or it can be subtle. I think of my own situation, and just as a practice, I don't suggest any tools or techniques to my clients that I wouldn't use myself. I think that when we read self-help books or or the pop psychology, there are a lot of techniques out there. They may sound good, but then when I offer the suggestion to a client, they seem kind of silly and trivial. So and cringeworthy. I think, journaling, I don't know. That's not everyone's cup of tea. So I think about the things that have helped me. And when one of the most stressful times in my life was when I went off on my own with my business. I was being confronted with financial demands, marketing, all these issues that go into a business practice. And I was under a tremendous amount of stress and anxiety. And there came a point where I had to look at my own, the ways I was and I wasn't dealing with stress. And so some of the things that worked for me was getting up a little earlier in the morning, doing some exercise, some stretching. Meditation is fantastic. I suggest that to all my clients. And that's something that's gotten a bad rap over when we think about hippie and Eastern religions and things like that. But it's really not. It's about clearing your mind, relaxing your body, excuse me, and getting yourself to a point where you can approach your day.
Well, you mentioned meditation or whatever someone might be calling it, and if you find someone who is really excelling at their profession, especially a public profession, what I would say a stressful environment, a sports figure, an actor, maybe even people in the public view for whatever reason, they usually, if they're open about it, usually incorporate something like that into their day, because it's there with them 24/7, and they are there in some cases to perform, and there's a lot of people watching them and criticizing them along with themselves. So I think you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody that's really at the top of their game, if you will, that doesn't incorporate that.
They use visual imagery, positive thinking, positive affirmations, reality testing. I think it's important to have, when we create goals, that they're realistic goals, and we get some feedback from trusted individuals to help us kind of manage those goals and put them into perspective.
Mike, you mentioned reality testing, so that's new to me. What would that be?
I think oftentimes our perceptions are skewed, and we can't read people's minds. And so what happens is we're walking Rorschach tests, where we project our own feelings and emotions and beliefs onto other people, and we may be oversensitive to what we sense in other people. So it's important to be open with communication, to be direct, ask questions, and also do some reality testing. If we have a situation where we're in over our head, we need to be able to delegate responsibilities. We need to have we don't use Rolodexes anymore, but our contacts, we need to have people in our contacts that we can trust. I find one of the greatest resources for me was when I reached out to a CPA, and I had to start managing my business, and that it just blew me away. The requirements that the average businessman just does not understand and have a grasp on, and that's just not my forte. So I had to reach out to my CPA and put a lot of the onus on him to tell me what I need to do. What can I do better? What am I not doing that I should be doing? And don't pull punches. Know your weaknesses, know your shortcomings, and look for some resources.
So someone to give you a non-BS assessment, if you will, of where you're at and maybe where you should be.
Right.
And I mean,
Honesty.
I've used the term trusted advisor. So and advisors can be someone in a professional capacity, or it could be a friend. And you want, I guess what we're saying is feedback from them. Is that what we're saying?
Right.
Okay.
And when I say reality testing, also I want to know what the other person is actually thinking rather than what I think they're thinking. We all have funny looks. I've got teenagers. Sometimes I might think they're in a different mindset than they really are, and that's just because a lot of factors. But number one is I can't read minds, so I have to do some reality testing. Relationships create a lot of anxiety, and that if we use open communication, sometimes that anxiety can be lessened and managed.
Makes sense. Are there, what's the term I'm looking for? telltale signs when we're experiencing stress and maybe we don't know it, or we've just, as you said, covered it up and not addressing it? I mean, there's certain things we could look for other than, hey, I walked into the doctor's office and they hooked me up to the blood pressure machine and it's not what I want to
Yeah.
hear. I mean, is there things that we should look for?
I think there are
Yeah.
some telltale signs that we're not dealing with stress. Irritability, strained relationships, strained marriages, strained family relationships with our children. I also think that substance use is a clear indication that doesn't get talked about enough. People's their use of alcohol, if it becomes a little bit more prominent in their life, it's probably an indication that there's some stress, some undealt with issues going on, and that's a slippery slope that can cause a lot of problems for people. So that's an indication that there is some unresolved issues going on.
So when you mention substance abuse, and okay, so let's take alcohol, for example. So it's common sometimes for people to have a drink as a refreshing beverage, but if I'm hearing you, you're saying, hey, if it becomes more common and the quantities are more, then maybe we're using it as a crutch for something?
Well, as part of my assessment process, I always talk to people about getting a wellness check with their doctor to see where their thyroid is, or their blood pressure, their overall health, physical health. But I also do an alcohol assessment to see where they stand with their drinking practices. Culturally, one has to be careful. Some people come from various cultures that where drinking is more prominent and accepted. But alcoholism is very prominent also and prevalent in our society. So, and it goes undiagnosed because of the social stigma to excessive drinking and alcohol use. So, with that said, it can cause a lot of problems, and it's safe to say that people would rather call it stress than alcoholism. And so oftentimes a person's drinking practices may get out of control and it becomes abusive, heavy drinking, and that can cause a lot of problems. And it becomes cyclical, where's the drinking end and the stress begins. It becomes they're very enmeshed.
Well, you mentioned people not wanting to talk about the alcohol because there's a social stigma. I could imagine that even addressing a stress issue or stress-related issue or having feedback from someone could be a stigmatism as well, because we don't want to talk about it, and it kind of goes back to, hey, for the most part, we're in a society where people are supposed to take care of things themselves, and they're tough.
right.
So just reaching out to someone could be a challenge. And how can we get people not to look at it that way? Because I think a lot of us do that for different reasons.
That's a delicate
Other than it
area.
happens to everyone.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a difficult topic altogether. How do you confront someone on their excessive alcohol use? People are very reluctant to use terms like alcoholism and substance abuse, and it's something that's just not talked about a whole lot in our society, and it's very stigmatized. So I try to be as delicate as I can. I try to separate the mental health aspects from the substance use, and later on I'll bring in a verbal questionnaire of a person's substance use, including medications that are prescribed by physicians.
Do you find that people have some common issues that bring about this stress? I mean, you mentioned financial and maybe occupations. I mean, is there some key factors that people have in their life that contribute to that, or is it just runs the gamut, and depending on what's going on, everyone can experience it, or are there some people more they might experience more than someone else, or
I think you have some folks with thinking styles that are more prone to stress. Obviously, the type A type personality that oftentimes gets identified as an intense individual. They may flourish in that type of mentality in a high stress environment, high adrenaline environment. Where it comes to be a problem is when it influences the family, the work performance, overall health. That's when I think it becomes a problem with individuals and something that ought to be looked at as something they can manage.
Well, that was interesting. So you mentioned type A personalities, and I would have thought, just off the top of my head, that maybe it wouldn't affect them, but the way you explained it, I absolutely could see that affecting them, and they probably don't know it at the time.
And here's something
Yeah.
also that a lot of folks don't understand. I think depression and anxiety go hand in hand, and stress is a common phenomena that we're all aware of. And then when it comes to anxiety, depression, those are the terms that have been kind of stigmatized a little bit. And so what I like to explain to clients is that anxiety, depression are two sides to the same coin. And based on a person's temperament, oftentimes stress can manifest one way or the other. So someone with a more depressive personality, when they're in finals week, for example, or if they're making a transition to high school, or something, work change, some type of a stress, or maybe they're just growing out older and they have to deal with deterioration of their physical capabilities. That's very stressful. Some people respond with anxiety, some people respond with depression, and there that oftentimes is predetermined by their temperament. So yeah, there are people that are prone to certain types of manifestations of the stress.
Okay. But I could also see that managing stress is just like people need to eat right. People should exercise. You should keep yourself occupied physically and mentally. So it's not something that I would think is a negative. It's something there.
Right.
We need to help. And maybe I'm not using the right term.
It's
We
an
need to help
ongoing
manage
struggle.
it.
Managing
Yeah,
stress.
okay.
Stress is a common. It's not going anywhere. A little stress is actually good for us. It pushes our potential. So how do we manage stress? I believe that there are certain. You asked me earlier some indications of some folks that might have problems with stress management, and I think having a quick temper would certainly fall into that category. I think folks that believe they need to control every aspect of their life, control it's fleeting. We oftentimes we believe we have more control than we really do, and that's manifest in our driving habits. I think a lot of road rage is caused by folks that think they have more control than they really do, and if they would accept the fact that they've got nowhere to go but sit there for a little bit in Houston traffic, take a deep breath, and just accept the process, I think they'd be better off, and they'd experience less stress. But those type of situations require a person to be proactive, do some breathing exercises if they need to, and just accept the fact that there are things out of their control.
Well, I'm learning a lot today. So when you mentioned that people who want to be in control experience stress when they're maybe not in control, or they realize they're not as in control as they think they are, I mean, that's interesting. I would have thought the opposite, but I could see how that's the case. And I mean, it just makes so much sense. And you mentioned traffic. So on the way over here, I mean, it's interesting. I've been driving in this town over 35 years, and it seems it's more of a chore to get on the road these days. And for lack of a better term, I think all the other drivers are just so much more stressed out, and they bring it onto the road, and it impacts everyone's around them. And you mentioned, hey, if people would just take a breath, and it's like, you probably got the 2 seconds that you need to slow down or watch for the other car, and you want to talk about some stress.
Right.
You have a wreck, and then you're really delayed. Then you're really going to be stressed out. So it's odd, but people that are under stress affect other people, and I mean it's families and their coworkers.
And when you think about the physiological responses that our body has, you think about some of the highways around here. I take 290 quite a bit. And for a long time, it's great now, but for a while there, the lanes were so narrow.
Right.
And there's a large concrete barrier. You get this vertigo driving at night oftentimes, and it's very irritating, and it increases one's blood pressure and pulse. And, your eyes start to hurt, and so you get these physiological changes, and that's a physical response to stress. And then if one's emotional stability is in question, they're going to be far less tolerant of those stimuli that are processing through their body.
Sure.
The stop and go, constant, it's stressful.
Yeah. Well, while we're still on the traffic, I saw on the news today that I think it was on 610, there was traffic at night. So there's a 4-lane road. People at night were driving the opposite direction just so they could not stay in traffic.
Yeah.
And so they had the example, there was 4 lanes and there was 2 cars taking up 2 lanes in the 4-lane, driving the opposite way in the middle of the night.
Wow.
And I mean, it's dangerous to them and it's dangerous to everyone else. So, okay. Well, we're going to take a break for a moment, and when we come back, we'll continue to talk about managing stress with Mike Erickson. And this is Planning for Win, Financial Guidance in Life. Thank you, and we'll be right back.
Securities and financial planning offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor. Member FINRA SIPC. The opinions voiced in this show are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, and financial advisor or tax advisor prior to investing.
We're back. This is Planning for Win, Financial Guidance in Life. I'm Kevin Pinkley, and we'll continue on the topic of managing stress. We have Mike Erickson here with us today. Thank you, Mike. So
Thank you.
let's continue. Where would you like to go next with the conversation of
Wow.
managing stress?
Managing stress. I just want to highlight the whole self-care piece. I think that for the most part, we don't do enough self-care. The big 3 I mentioned earlier, eating, sleeping, exercise. We need to incorporate those type of things in our day, every day. And around stressful events, I had an advisor in college that used to say, circle the wagons when we're going through stressful events. And that's when we take advantage of the resources that we have, whether it's a loved one, friends, family, cohorts. Those are the individuals that are there for us. We've been there for them. It's time to call in some favors. Circle the wagons, get enough people around to support you so you know that you're not going through these stressful events alone.
Okay. So you mentioned support. So I'll go back to the family. And I think we all interpret and manage stress maybe a little differently. I'm sure there's some things that are similar. So when we're talking about the family unit, mom, dad, and the kiddos, people could be experiencing stress at different times. And maybe as a parent, I would recognize stress in my spouse, but maybe I don't recognize it in the children. So how, especially as parents, I mean, things to some degree for kiddos are a lot better than they were in the past, but to some degree there's new and more pressures than maybe were in the past. So
That's a
how
whole
could we,
show.
how could we recognize that briefly and because, we're not really looking for that stress in adults, we're looking for it in children, whatever their age might be.
Children demonstrate stress far different than adults. As adults, I think we all can, to some degree, understand what it looks like. But in children, you're going to see more anger management issues. You're going to see more irritability, more isolation. Typically, you'll see a change in their friends, who they hang with. You might see some relationship issues. I think this whole topic of social media, it's gotten really out of control with the amount of time that children spend on social media, and the opportunities for stress are increasing exponentially. You think about when we were children, we didn't have immediate access to everyone.
Right.
And now you can contact folks through their cell phone. You can text them immediately. You'll know whether they get it because there's a read receipt. You can go on Facebook or whatever these kids are using. That's Facebook is kind of an old folks social media now. It's Instagram, Snapchat, some of these others.
Right.
But there's a higher degree of bullying that occurs, social bullying, shaming, with the pictures, the sexting, all that stuff. There's so many ways that kids can get themselves in trouble on social media. And so, and to a large degree, that increases stress, self-esteem issues, and there's a higher degree of suicide in kids that are being cyberbullied. So, and that's a whole other avenue altogether that needs to be looked at. But parents, we can look for those signs in children: irritability, social isolation, relying more on electronic means of communication versus the face-to-face contact, hanging out with friends, going to ball games, doing the stuff that typically is a little more healthy.
Okay. Well, yeah, you mentioned when we were younger, we had downtime. And our world was maybe a little smaller back then. And, we had contact with people in the neighborhoods and, a little bit beyond that. But, I mean, you can literally have contact with people throughout the city, throughout the state, throughout the country, throughout the world. And there's immediate access to, in some
immediate
cases, good and
gratification.
bad. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
I remember the stereotype of people sitting by the telephone waiting for that girl or boy to call them, and now it's just immediate. You know,
Right.
if the person hasn't responded to their text in a matter of seconds, it's the world's coming to an end. It's just tremendous. It's an incredible swing.
Well, I'm getting stressed out just thinking about social media. Yeah. So, in some regards, I'm glad I'm not growing up with that influence.
One of the greatest
Yeah.
things a person can do for themselves is to give them a break once in a while from social media. I use Facebook, I think, as a business outreach and maybe to connect with some of my family back in Minnesota. But I find that a lot of the interactions people have on social media, they're very provocative and they can become very hostile.
Right.
Which it creates a hostile worldview, which adds to our anxiety and depression and stress.
So we just need to recognize that the children, whatever their age are, if they're 8 or 18, maybe they process stress a little differently, and those key factors that you mentioned, we need to be on the lookout.
Oh, they sure do.
Yeah.
Irritability, isolation, those are the big ones, the big signs of stress, and eating habits.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask more about isolation. So isolation is maybe withdrawing from contact from the family, or it could just be, hey, I'm going in the bedroom and shutting the door. Okay. Yeah.
Which is typical for adolescence.
Yeah.
So there's a degree of there's a judgment one has to make. What's excessive and what is age appropriate. It's typical for adolescents to want to be more isolative and have more alone time, rely on their friends, their social connections more so than the family unit. That's age appropriate. But when kids start backing away and they rely solely, or if there's a dramatic change, those are some indications that something's going on.
Okay. So since we're talking about the kids, one of the stressors can be what happens after high school. And whether it's, hey, I'm going into the workforce, I'm going into some type of further education, I'm going in the military. How can we get ahead of that, that maybe they're not so stressed out with, and I'm just looking at examples that I've seen where they kind of think, hey, at 18, I need to make all my life decisions now. And that's really not the case.
Just this week I read an article stating that the millennials are the highest stressed and anxious generation that we've seen. And that says something, considering that we've had things like the Depression, Cold War, things like that are, that significantly jeopardize our safety. And these folks are going out into the workforce. I think there's some contributing factors. Some are that the schools place a greater focus on career earlier in their academic careers, such as middle school, getting them on a path to success for, so-called success, preparing them for college. I think there's a big push. There's an assumption that every child needs to go to college, when that just plain isn't the truth.
Sure.
So, yeah, there's a great deal of stress. That's a large transitional period. I tell families all the time that, the 2 points where kids will experience tremendous stress is puberty and graduation. What's right around the corner? It's it's stressful.
Yep.
It can be very stressful, and you're right. Getting out into a career, oftentimes, people come out of school right now. They're the highest educated generation that we've ever seen, and the jobs just are not given to them. They're going to have to work for them.
Yeah. Wow, that's a lot going on. Are there, and we kind of talked about this earlier, are there certain occupations? I mean, you talked about law enforcement, and I would include, what we would call first responders. But are there certain occupations? I mean, those kind of come to mind when we think of, hey, those could be high stress environments. Are there some that you see that maybe you don't think of high stress environments, but you see maybe with your contacts and your clients of like, this is really a stressful environment, and people may not know it, but it's a pressure cooker maybe in that workplace.
I think you're right.
Yeah,
We think of the first responders as being high stress. We think of physicians and people in the medical field. We think of teachers, high stress jobs. But something that is interesting to me are the number of engineers that I see that come in under a tremendous amount of stress and pressure. Oftentimes they're very analytical. They're very articulate, educated, intelligent individuals, and those folks are prone to, I think, overthinking things, and they struggle with giving up some of that control and backing off and self-regulating themselves, using meditation, taking a step back, understanding that you can't fix everything, you can't have an answer for everything.
Right.
So I just find it fascinating that some of the most intelligent folks in our society, the engineers, may be some of the most anxious people I work with, and the most stressed individuals.
Well, now that you mentioned that, I could see that because what they're working on, I guess, could be stressful. I mean, they're usually people who like problems and like to solve them.
Yep.
And I guess sometimes that's a good thing, but sometimes, as you said, maybe you can't solve everything, or maybe it takes a little while, and there's just some things we always got to work with. So,
And stress in the workplace.
Yeah.
Engineers are under time constraints and demands, financial demands by the companies.
Right.
So it's an interesting field.
Well, that's not one I would have thought of, but it makes perfect sense now. But here's an occupation, parents. So that's never ending. Right. So whether we have young ones, whether we have teenagers or adults, so that's stressful.
I work with a lot of kids, and
Yeah.
behind every kid is our parents.
Right.
And so with the high degree of children I work with the families as well, and try to help the parents manage their stress. Just this morning, I was dealing with a child that's under a tremendous amount of anxiety and stress, and I turned to the mom and I said, "Well, how are you doing?" And she looked at me and she turned white, and she wasn't expecting to be put on the hot seat. Turns out she's not managing her stress very well either.
Well, no one probably asked her that question before.
Right.
Yeah.
She wasn't expecting it to be about her.
Yeah. Well, that brings up something that just popped into my head. So, over the years, I'm sure there's been different ways that are common that people handle stress, and some of them are probably okay in work, and some of them are probably not. Have you seen the introduction of maybe a solution for managing stress that we didn't know of or focus in the past that's positive now? And I know I just kind of threw that out of left field. But
Again, I think meditation
Yeah.
has grown in popularity. Yoga is incredible. Yoga used to have this stigma to it, and a lot of men enjoy yoga. I do.
Right.
I enjoy yoga. I don't have as much time now, but when I was having some issues with my business, I was going to yoga every other day.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. So I'm part of that generation that, it meant a certain thing, and some of it was correct and some of it wasn't. And I think the problem for us, especially the guys, is the word, okay, yoga, okay? We're not supposed to be there. Well, you can call it whatever you want,
Right.
and some people do, and there's different terms for it. And the interesting thing is that, okay, once you get over that, which it's a hang up for yourself because I had it, hey, once you get on the mat or the floor or outside and you're like, at the end of it, you're like, hey, this is really helpful. I
Right.
feel good mentally
Feels
and
great.
physically. And then the other thing is there's this preconceived notion of, okay, and I'll use me as an example. Okay, that's not a man's exercise
Right.
or a man's workout. Okay, you can make it as easy or difficult as you choose.
Right.
And, it's amazing how much you can be sweating and huffing and puffing, if that's what you want, within, a square or a circle. And you're like, oh my gosh.
Right.
So, yeah, I would agree that there's benefits there, whatever you want to call it or whatever routine. But that is positive. So,
I think our society is changing a little bit.
Yeah.
And things, like getting a manicure, pedicure.
Yep.
It's not so uncommon to see men in these nail shops. Yoga, it's not just for women.
Yeah.
It's not just for housewives. I think folks can go. When I used to go on my lunch break, I would see a number of men that were doing the exact same thing.
well, and this is not really the same, but, going back a number of years, football players. Okay, I think Lynn Swann for the Steelers used to bring the guys to ballet.
Herschel Walker did ballet.
Okay, I didn't know that. And it was like, I'm sure there was laughs and jokes until they got there.
Yep.
And it was like, okay, this is kind of hard. I got to get my act together so I can finish this session. And if I'm being honest, hey, it was helpful. So, yeah, so that's a good example, yoga. I would completely agree, whatever we're calling it. What, for the people listening, I mean, is there such a thing as a typical client for you, or is it just people who are looking for some solutions regardless of age, occupation, or background?
I think people start reaching out, looking for what's available, and they find me. I deal with each person on an individual basis and try to create a treatment plan for them based on what's accessible, what's realistic for them, and I give them an opportunity to tell their story. A lot of people just deal, I think, with life's ups and downs, and it becomes to the clinical level. And so there's this subtle, gradual creation of the stress, and then they're shocked by wondering sometimes if life wouldn't be better without them, which borders on suicidal thinking, and then that's a crisis. And so I think folks start reaching out for help, and then once they open up, they may hopefully realize that they don't have to live like that anymore. And sometimes a lot of times people realize that their life has gotten a little away from them, and things have gotten worse than they anticipated.
Since you mentioned reaching out for help, I would imagine that once people seek help, they're glad they did, but it's that first step or that first conversation that keeps people from doing it. So how could people address that to where they reach out to people such as yourself or have that first conversation, and then once they're there, they're glad they're there, but
Right.
it's just that initial step.
Well, I tell people, beware the crooked cure. And that what I mean by that is making the call does not treat you.
Okay.
Making the appointment, oftentimes people think when they call a therapist to make an appointment that suddenly, they do feel better. They're making some progress, but they haven't done anything yet. So
Okay.
all they've done is made an appointment. And so I encourage people, I encourage folks to make that first appointment. I send reminders. I reach out to people, try to get them into my office, and then I try to make it as comfortable of an experience as possible. I do ask them what their past experience has been with counselors, with therapists. Do they take any medication? What's their experience? Because I want to know what they're anticipating, what
Right.
their expectations are, and sometimes I have to clarify some of the goals, some of the expectations, some of the benefits, limitations of counseling. I mean, I
Right.
can't fix everyone.
Right.
And so sometimes I do need to refer folks to a hospital if they're in a critical situation, or make a recommendation that they talk to their doctor about possibly starting an antidepressant. I am not shy to make recommendations and referrals if necessary.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that. I think a lot of times in different professions, people say, well, aren't they all the same? Okay, so I hear it with financial advisors. Aren't all financial advisors the same? And the example I like to use is, are all pilots the same? Okay, would you fly with everyone who has a pilot's license? Of course not. That's the most ridiculous thing. So maybe if someone had an experience before that didn't resolve the issue, it doesn't mean they should stop. They should just find the right person for them,
Right.
and then continue. And but yeah, sometimes people say, well, they all had the same education or to some degree, and it's just like I'll use the example of mechanics. Okay, so most people today with cars being as complicated as they are, they have some help, and not all mechanics are the same.
They've done
Yeah.
research to show that the relationship is the therapy. They've asked people that have made great strides in therapy, and what was the greatest, the benefit to, what was the greatest solution? And it wasn't these techniques or the interventions or the homework. It was the relationship, the honesty, the deep connection that comes with a healthy therapeutic relationship. That's, I think, what fosters a lot of growth in individuals. So there are some ethical situations, that come up because it can be people can make themselves very vulnerable in counseling, and if they're not used to it, it might feel a little strange. So for me, I need to make sure that there are strict boundaries and things are handled ethically. But I think that the relationship is the therapy. And when people come to my office, I want to make a deep connection with them. I want to give them every opportunity to find solutions that work for them versus just give them a bunch of tools and cliche responses.
Right. No, that makes sense. Our primary care physician for our children, every time we go in there, we feel like we're his only patient. And there's nothing else going on at that moment other than the reason we're there. And it's the relationship. So, yes, there's a level of expertise there, but we're really there for the level of care and
Right.
caring. Yeah, okay.
And I would drive farther to see someone like that. I may even pay out of pocket versus use insurance for someone like that. So it's something that it's an interesting dilemma these days. A lot of therapists don't take insurance. I do take insurance.
Okay.
It was just a business decision on my part to stick with the panels that I'm on, and part of that is due to the fact that when I reached out for a therapist myself, I was surprised at how few therapists take insurance
Right.
anymore.
Okay,
So,
well, that's news to me. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
there's a trend, I think, in the psychological community for folks to venture away from insurance just because of the restraints that are placed on them, sometimes unrealistic. And it's a business decision that they make. So,
Red tape, it sounds like.
red
Yeah.
tape,
Okay.
paperwork, unrealistic expectations of short sessions.
Okay. Well, so I was going to ask. Yes. So maybe there's no shortcuts, and there's maybe not a timeline. I think there's probably a timeline to start seeing improvement or get better, but I would imagine in some cases that it's just ongoing self-help. Okay.
It's insight-oriented, trying to figure out what's going on, and then giving it back to the client to do something about it. And I'm not trying to skirt the question by not talking about the frequency, but every client is different. Some people come in and they have a clear indication of what they need, and they can get it done in a few sessions. Other times, people really appreciate the long-standing relationship that they develop, and they want to keep it going as long as possible. So I have to be sensitive to the individual, what they want, what they need, and try to accommodate that,
Okay.
and not foster dependence. I don't believe that that's also an ethical dilemma. I want people to be empowered to make their own choices, to be healthy on their own. When they leave my office, that's when the actual therapy begins, by them putting into practice some of the things that we've talked about and seeing what works, what doesn't, and then coming back.
Okay. So there's work to do on their own, is what you're saying. Okay.
To varying degrees, yes.
Yeah. Okay. The you mentioned I would drive further to see someone. What did you mean by that?
Well, I take my daughter to a doctor that's about a 45-minute drive because I really appreciate the relationship that we have
Okay,
with that facility, with that medical practice. It's important to find somebody you trust.
Okay.
And in a city the size of Houston, it's not uncommon to drive 45 minutes to see someone.
Right. Well, I'm really glad you brought that up because a lot of times you'll hear people come up with some notion of, regardless of what they're looking for, is that,
Convenience.
yeah, convenience. And it's like, okay, that person might not be two streets over, and they might
Right.
not even be in your zip code, and you need to find the right person.
Right.
So, okay. Well,
And
no,
that's a
that's
big problem in rural communities.
Yes,
There's
yeah.
there's a limited number of therapists, and so telemedicine has really taken off as a result. And I certainly am not an expert in that field, but virtual therapy, using Skype, the various Zoom, telemedicine has taken off for these rural communities.
Well, that's probably a whole nother topic just
It
in
sure
itself.
is.
Okay. Well, Mike, I think we covered a lot today, and if you'd like, you're always welcome back. We can continue
you.
with a topic or a new one. One more time, Mike, if people wanted to get in touch with you, how might they do that?
Well, they can always reach me through my website, ericksoncounseling.com. And the full name, you can always Google Erickson Counseling and Mediation. You can reach me through Facebook, Erickson Counseling and Mediation, or just reach me through my email.
Okay.
And that's listed on the website as well.
Well, thank you, Mike. And thank you for listening to Planning for Win Financial Guidance in Life. This is Kevin Pinkley. And you can join us next month, the last Tuesday of the month at 1 p.m. And you can check us out online at Lone Star Community Radio. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Securities and financial planning offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor. Member FINRA SIPC. The opinions voiced in this show are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, and financial advisor or tax advisor prior to investing.